"How are babies made?" my Apache neighbor asked. I hesitated and said, maybe a kiss." The afternoon was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a neighborhood when the sun is warm but not harsh, and most people are inside resting. The narrator lived in a small rented house at the edge of the street, a place where neighbors knew each other by face, if not always by name. It was not a rich area, but it was peaceful. People smiled when they passed, children played outside without fear, and evenings often carried the smell of food from many different homes. The Apache neighbor lived 2 houses away. He was a calm, friendly man who greeted everyone with a nod or a short wave. He had moved there with his family a few years ago. His culture was different, but kindness made communication easy. Over time, casual greetings turned into short conversations, and short conversations slowly turned into familiarity. They talked about weather, work, and small daily problems. Nothing deep, nothing serious. Just the kind of connection that grows naturally when people share the same street. That day, the narrator was sitting outside on a simple plastic chair, enjoying the breeze. A cup of tea rested in their hand, slowly cooling. The sounds of children laughing echoed from nearby houses. It was a normal day, one that did not feel important in any special way. Moments like that often pass unnoticed, yet sometimes they become memories for unexpected reasons. The Apache neighbor walked by with his child. The child was curious, bright-eyed, and full of questions, like most children are. He often stopped to ask about things he saw: ants on the ground, birds on electric wires, clouds shaped like animals. The narrator had answered many of those questions before, always with patience and a smile. That day, the child stopped again. He looked thoughtful, as if carrying a big idea in his small head. He tugged gently at his parent's sleeve, whispered something, then turned his attention to the narrator. His face was serious but not nervous, just curious. The narrator smiled, expecting another harmless question, maybe about the tea or why the sky looked so pale. Instead, the child asked something completely unexpected. "How are babies made?" The words landed in the air and stayed there. For a brief moment, everything felt frozen. The breeze still moved, the street remained quiet, but inside the narrator's mind, everything rushed at once. Thoughts collided, emotions tangled, and uncertainty filled the space where a simple answer should have been. The narrator felt their face grow warm. They glanced at the neighbor, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The neighbor looked surprised too, but not angry, more like caught off guard. It was clear that the question was innocent. There was no bad intention, no hidden meaning, just a child's natural curiosity. Still, the narrator hesitated. They had not expected this. No one prepares you for such moments. Schools do not teach how to answer sudden questions from children, especially when you are not their parent. The narrator did not want to say anything wrong. They did not want to offend the neighbor or confuse the child. Most of all, they did not want to use words that were not appropriate. Silence stretched for a few seconds. The child waited patiently, trusting that adults always have answers. That trust made the moment even heavier. The narrator felt the pressure of responsibility. They wished the question had been about birds again. In that pause, memories surfaced. The narrator remembered being a child themselves, asking questions that adults avoided. They remembered strange explanations, half-truths, and stories that did not make sense. At the time, those answers were accepted without doubt. Only later did confusion appear. Now the narrator stood on the other side of that experience. They took a small breath, searching for something harmless, something light. They did not want to explain something complicated. They did not want to cross boundaries. They just wanted to move past the moment safely. So they smiled awkwardly and said, maybe a kiss." The words came out quickly, almost without thought. As soon as they were spoken, the narrator felt both relief and uncertainty. Relief because the silence was broken. uncertainty because they were not sure if the answer was right, even in its simplicity. The child's face brightened. He nodded, satisfied. To him, the answer made sense. Kisses were signs of love. Love made families. In his young mind, everything connected easily. He smiled and skipped away, already thinking about something else. The neighbor let out a soft laugh, not loud, not mocking, just a gentle sound that eased the tension. He shook his head slightly, as if amused by the situation. There was no anger in his expression, no offense taken. Instead, there was understanding. The narrator felt their shoulders relax. The moment had passed, but its echo remained. They sipped their tea, now cold, and watched as the neighbor and child walked down the street. The child pointed at something new, already lost in another question. When the street grew quiet again, the narrator sat alone with their thoughts. What seemed like a small moment suddenly felt important. They wondered if they had done the right thing. Was avoiding the truth better than saying nothing? Was a simple answer enough? They looked around the neighborhood. Houses stood close together, each with its own stories, beliefs, and ways of raising children. What was normal in one home might be different in another. The narrator realized how delicate shared spaces could be. Words mattered. Intentions mattered even more. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the road, the narrator reflected on how children see the world. To them, questions are not uncomfortable. They are just questions. It is adults who attach fear, shame, or confusion to them. Children only want to understand. That thought stayed with the narrator. The question, the pause, the simple answer, all of it replayed in their mind. What began as a peaceful afternoon had quietly turned into a moment of reflection. The narrator did not know yet that this small exchange would stay with them for a long time. At that moment, it was just an awkward encounter, something to smile about later. But deep down, it planted a seed, a reminder of how honesty, care, and responsibility often meet in the most unexpected ways. As evening settled in and the call of birds faded, the narrator stood up, carried their empty cup inside, and closed the door. Outside, life continued as usual. Inside, a simple question had already changed the way they thought about communication, innocence, and the quiet power of words. And that was only the beginning. That night, the narrator could not sleep easily. The house was quiet, but the mind was not. The small moment from the afternoon kept returning again and again, like a soft knock that refused to fade. The question, the pause, the simple answer, everything replayed in slow motion. What should have been forgotten already felt heavier with each passing hour. The narrator lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it moved in slow circles. Each turn seemed to bring another thought. Was the answer too careless? Was it unfair to the child? Or was it harmless, just a gentle way to move past an uncomfortable moment? The narrator did not know. What they did know was that the child's innocent face kept appearing in their thoughts, full of trust and curiosity. Morning arrived quietly. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, warming the room. The narrator got up, made tea, and tried to return to normal life. But even simple tasks felt different. While brushing teeth, while tying shoes, while stepping outside, the mind kept drifting back to the same moment. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Doors opened, footsteps echoed, and the sound of daily life returned. The narrator greeted a few neighbors with a nod, but their attention wandered. They watched children walk to school, bags swinging on their backs, laughter filling the street. Each child seemed like a reminder of how young minds work, open, curious, trusting. Later that day, the narrator went to the small grocery store at the corner. It was a familiar place, where people often exchanged small talk while waiting in line. As the narrator picked up basic items, they noticed the Apache neighbor standing near the counter. He was alone this time. For a brief moment, the narrator considered turning away. Not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. Should they bring up the moment from yesterday, or pretend it never happened? Before the narrator could decide, the neighbor noticed them and smiled. "Good morning," he said warmly. "Good morning," the narrator replied. They stood near each other, waiting as the shopkeeper counted items. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it carried something unspoken. The narrator felt a small knot form in their stomach. They wondered if the neighbor had thought about the question too. As if sensing the hesitation, the neighbor chuckled softly. "Kids ask the strangest things, don't they?" The narrator smiled, relieved that the moment was being addressed gently. "They really do," they said. "Always when you least expect it." The neighbor nodded. "My child asks questions nonstop. Sometimes I don't even know how to answer." That honesty surprised the narrator. It felt comforting to hear. "Yesterday caught me off guard," the narrator admitted. "I didn't want to say something wrong." The neighbor laughed, shaking his head lightly. "You handled it fine." He was happy with the answer. That reassurance eased something inside the narrator. Still, they felt the need to explain themselves. "I just didn't want to confuse him or cross any line." The neighbor looked thoughtful. "Every family has its own way," he said. "We explain things slowly when the time feels right. For now, curiosity is just curiosity." They paid for their items and stepped outside together. The sun was brighter now, and the street felt alive. As they walked a few steps side by side, the narrator realized how much weight they had placed on the moment. What felt huge inside their mind had been much simpler in reality. After they parted ways, the narrator walked home with lighter steps. Still, the topic stayed with them. The conversation had not erased the question, but it had softened its edges. It reminded the narrator that not every answer must be perfect. Sometimes intention matters more than words. That afternoon, the narrator found themselves observing children more closely. At the park nearby, kids ran freely, inventing games, asking questions without fear. One child asked why the sky was blue. Another asked why birds could fly but humans could not. No one seemed worried about answering those questions incorrectly. Adults replied with simple explanations, stories, or sometimes playful guesses. The narrator realized something important. Children do not demand full knowledge. They accept what fits their world at that moment. It is adults who overthink, adding layers of worry and doubt. Later, while sitting on the same plastic chair as the previous day, the narrator thought about their own childhood again. They remembered asking questions and receiving unclear answers. Back then, those answers were enough. Confusion only came later when understanding grew. As evening approached, the Apache neighbor passed by again with his child. The child waved excitedly when he saw the narrator. "Hello," he called out. "Hello," the narrator replied, smiling genuinely this time. The child ran ahead, chasing something only he could see. The neighbor paused for a moment. "He talked about the kiss answer," he said with a grin. "He told his mother that kisses are very powerful." The narrator laughed, surprised. "I didn't mean to turn it into something big." "It's okay," the neighbor said. In his world, love explains many things. After they said goodbye, the narrator sat quietly, thinking about that sentence. Love explains many things. It was simple but true. Perhaps the answer had not been so wrong after all. That night, the narrator felt calmer. The ceiling fan still turned above, but the thoughts were slower now, gentler. The moment no longer felt like a mistake. Instead, it felt like a lesson. The narrator understood that life often puts people in unexpected situations. There is rarely time to prepare. What matters is responding with care, respect, and awareness. Not every question needs a detailed answer. Sometimes, a soft response is enough to protect innocence while honoring curiosity. As sleep finally came, the narrator felt grateful. Grateful for understanding neighbors, for patient children, and for moments that quietly teach without making noise. The question from the child had opened a door to reflection, communication, and empathy. The story was no longer just about an awkward answer. It was about learning to pause, to listen, and to respond with kindness, even when unsure. And as the narrator drifted into sleep, they sensed that this experience would shape how they spoke, how they listened, and how they handled questions in the future. The journey was far from over. This was only the second step. Days passed, and life slowly returned to its usual rhythm, yet the moment did not disappear completely. Instead, it settled quietly inside the narrator's thoughts, showing up at unexpected times. While washing dishes, while walking to work, or while watching children play, the memory returned, not loudly, but gently, like a reminder waiting to be understood more deeply. The narrator began to notice small details they had ignored before. The way children listened closely when adults spoke, the way they accepted answers without questioning tone or intent. It became clear that children were not just asking questions to get facts. They were trying to make sense of the world using the people they trusted. One afternoon, the narrator visited a nearby park. It was a place full of life, swings moving back and forth, laughter floating in the air, parents sitting on benches watching carefully. The narrator sat down under a tree, enjoying the shade. Nearby, two children were talking seriously. One asked the other why adults always looked tired. The other replied with confidence, saying it was because adults thought too much. The narrator smiled at that answer. It felt true. As they sat there, the narrator thought about how adults often complicate simple things. Questions that come naturally to children can feel heavy to adults because of fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of being misunderstood, fear of crossing invisible boundaries. But children do not carry that fear. They only carry curiosity. That realization changed something inside the narrator. Later that week, the narrator met the Apache neighbor again, this time during a community gathering. It was a small event organized by the street residents. Nothing fancy, just tea, snacks, and shared conversation. People from different backgrounds sat together, talking about daily life. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed. The narrator and the neighbor ended up sitting next to each other. Their conversation started casually but slowly moved deeper. They talked about childhood memories, about how different their upbringings were, yet how similar childhood curiosity felt across cultures. "When I was young," the neighbor said, "I asked my grandmother many questions. She never gave long answers. She would say just enough to satisfy me at that moment." The narrator nodded. Maybe that's what children need, not full explanations, just something that fits their understanding. The neighbor smiled. Exactly, truth does not have to be heavy. It can be gentle. That sentence stayed with the narrator. As the evening continued, the neighbor's child ran up to them again. He looked thoughtful, serious in a way only children can be. "Why do adults think so much?" he asked suddenly. The narrator paused, but this time the pause felt different. There was no panic, no rush, just a moment of calm consideration. "Because adults have many responsibilities," the narrator said simply. "But sometimes they forget to enjoy simple things." The child nodded, satisfied. "I like simple things," he said, then ran off again. The narrator watched him go, feeling something warm inside. That answer felt right, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest and kind. Over the next few days, the narrator became more aware of how they spoke, not just to children but to everyone. They listened more. They paused before responding. They realized that communication was not about having the best words, but about understanding the person in front of you. At home, the narrator thought again about their own childhood. They remembered moments when adults dismissed their questions or laughed them away. Those moments had made them feel small and confused. They realized how important it was to take questions seriously, even when they seemed simple or awkward. One evening, while sitting quietly by the window, the narrator reflected on how a single innocent question had led to so much thought. It was strange how life worked that way. Big lessons often came from small moments. The narrator also noticed a change in themselves. They felt calmer, more patient. Situations that once caused stress now felt manageable. They understood that uncertainty was not something to fear, it was something to accept. A few days later, the narrator received a visit from a friend. As they talked, the conversation turned to children and parenting. The narrator shared the story, not as something embarrassing, but as something meaningful. The friend listened carefully, then laughed softly. "You know," the friend said, "kids don't remember exact answers. They remember how you made them feel." That sentence felt powerful. The narrator realized that the child might forget the words "maybe a kiss," but he would remember the kindness, the attention, and the respect in that moment. That night, the narrator wrote in a small notebook they kept for thoughts. They wrote about curiosity, about responsibility, and about how silence and words both carry meaning. Writing helped them see things clearly. The narrator understood now that part 3 of this journey was not about the question anymore. It was about growth. It was about learning how to respond to life without fear. It was about understanding that being human means not always having answers, and that was okay. As days turned into weeks, the memory no longer felt awkward. It felt like a turning point, a moment when the narrator began to see communication differently, not as a performance but as a connection. And somewhere in the neighborhood, children continued to ask questions. The world continued to turn, but inside the narrator something had shifted, quietly, gently, and permanently. This was not the end of the story, it was a deeper beginning. As time went on, the small moment that began with an innocent question slowly grew into something larger in the narrator's life. It was no longer just a memory or a lesson. It started to affect how the narrator behaved in everyday situations, especially when dealing with people who were younger, quieter, or unsure. One afternoon, the narrator was asked by a local community group to help supervise children during an evening activity. It was nothing serious, just keeping an eye on them while they played games and drew pictures. The narrator agreed without much thought, but when the day came, they felt a quiet nervousness. Being around children now felt different. It carried more responsibility than before. The children gathered in a small open hall. Some were loud and energetic, others shy and watchful. The narrator noticed how quickly children observed adults. A smile made them relax. A harsh tone made them step back. Everything mattered. As the activity began, the narrator moved between groups, helping where needed. One child struggled to finish a drawing and looked frustrated. The narrator knelt down and encouraged them gently. The child smiled and tried again. That small success brought unexpected happiness to both of them. Later, a different child asked a question, not about anything serious, just why people grow old. The narrator felt a familiar pause, but this time there was no fear. They answered calmly, choosing simple words. The child listened, nodded, and returned to playing. In that moment, the narrator realized something important. Confidence does not come from knowing everything. It comes from being present and sincere. However, not everything went smoothly. A few days later, the narrator overheard 2 adults talking nearby. One of them mentioned the earlier incident with the neighbor's child. The story had traveled farther than expected. The tone was not angry but curious, slightly judgmental. "People should be careful what they say to children," one person said. The words struck the narrator deeply. Old doubts returned. Had they been careless after all? Had a harmless moment turned into something others misunderstood? That evening, the narrator felt heavy again. The calm they had built felt shaken. They replayed the conversation in their head, wondering how stories change when passed from one person to another. Intentions get lost. Context disappears. Only fragments remain. The narrator realized that even kind actions can be questioned. Even gentle answers can be misunderstood. This was a difficult truth to accept. For the first time since the incident, the narrator felt defensive. They wanted to explain themselves, to correct the story, to control how others saw the situation. But another thought followed. Was that necessary? That night the narrator sat quietly, reflecting deeply. Life was not about pleasing everyone. It was about acting with honesty and respect, even when others did not fully understand. The next day the narrator met the Apache neighbor again. They decided not to avoid the topic this time. They spoke openly, sharing how the spreading story had made them feel uneasy. The neighbor listened carefully, without interruption. Then he smiled gently. "People talk," he said. "They always will. What matters is intention. I know your intention." Those words brought relief. The neighbor's trust felt grounding. It reminded the narrator that the people directly involved understood the truth. Outside opinions mattered less. The neighbor continued, "Children learn more from behavior than words." He saw kindness. That stays longer than any sentence. The narrator felt gratitude. That conversation helped close a wound they had not fully noticed before. From that point on, the narrator made a quiet decision. They would not let fear of judgment stop them from responding with care. Silence can protect, but it can also distance. Balance was needed. The narrator became more thoughtful, not quieter. They chose words carefully but did not avoid conversation. They accepted that mistakes were part of being human. In the following weeks, the narrator noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. People seemed more open during conversations. Children greeted them warmly. Parents trusted them more during shared activities. None of this was loud or dramatic. It happened naturally. The narrator understood now that part 4 of this journey was about conflict, not loud conflict, but inner conflict. The struggle between fear and responsibility, between silence and honesty, between worrying about judgment and choosing kindness. It was not an easy balance. Some days felt uncertain, but growth rarely feels comfortable. One evening, while walking home under a quiet sky, the narrator looked up at the stars. They thought about how small moments connect to larger paths. A simple question had led to reflection. Reflection had led to growth. Growth had led to challenge. And challenge, they realized, was not something to avoid. It was something to learn from. The narrator walked on, feeling steady again, not perfect, not certain, but aware, and that awareness felt like strength. The story was moving closer to its end. One more step remained. The final change did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, quietly, like morning light spreading across a room. The narrator did not wake up one day feeling completely different. Instead, they began to notice that situations which once caused tension now felt easier to face. The lesson from that small question had settled deep inside, shaping thoughts and actions without making noise. One morning, the narrator was walking through the neighborhood when they saw the Apache neighbor and his child standing near the gate. The child was trying to explain something serious, using wide hand movements and big expressions. The neighbor listened patiently, nodding, never interrupting. The narrator stopped for a moment, watching from a distance. That simple scene felt meaningful. It showed what the narrator had learned over time. Listening matters more than speaking. Giving space to curiosity allows understanding to grow naturally. The child noticed the narrator and waved excitedly. "Hello," he called. "Hello," the narrator replied, waving back. This time there was no awkwardness, no memory of discomfort, only familiarity and ease. The child ran over and started talking about a bird he had seen earlier. The narrator listened carefully, asking gentle questions, encouraging the excitement. The child's eyes lit up with every response. When the child ran back to his parent, the neighbor smiled and said, "He likes talking to you. You listen." Those words stayed with the narrator for the rest of the day. They felt like quiet confirmation that the journey had meant something real. Later that week, the narrator was invited to a small family gathering by another neighbor. Children were everywhere, moving freely between adults. The narrator joined the group, feeling calm instead of cautious. When children asked questions, the narrator answered simply, kindly, without fear. One child asked why people sometimes look sad. The narrator thought for a moment and said, "Because life can be heavy sometimes, but sharing helps." The child nodded thoughtfully and leaned closer to their parent. That was enough. In that moment, the narrator understood something clearly. Children do not need perfect explanations. They need honesty shaped by care. They need adults who respect their curiosity without rushing it. As the evening continued, the narrator felt a sense of belonging. Not because they had done something special, but because they were present, fully present. That night, while walking home, the narrator reflected on how much had changed since that first afternoon. Back then, a simple question had caused hesitation and fear. Now, questions felt like invitations rather than threats. The narrator realized that growth does not always come from big events. Sometimes it begins with discomfort. Sometimes it begins with not knowing what to say. At home, the narrator sat quietly and thought about the lesson they would carry forward. It was not about children alone. It was about communication in every part of life. With friends, with neighbors, with strangers. People ask questions not to test others but to connect. Avoiding answers builds distance. Thoughtful responses build trust. The narrator also learned that it is okay to say, "I don't know," when needed. Honesty creates space for learning. Pretending to know everything only creates pressure. In the days that followed, the narrator felt more confident in conversations. Not louder, not dominant, just steady. They listened more than they spoke, and when they spoke, they chose words with intention. One afternoon, the Apache neighbor stopped by for tea. They talked about daily life, about work, about hopes for the future. At one point, the neighbor said, "That question my child asked, it started many good conversations for me too." The narrator smiled. "It did for me as well." They both sat quietly for a moment, understanding passing between them without words. As the seasons slowly changed, the narrator continued living their life, but with a deeper awareness. Moments were no longer rushed. Small interactions were valued. Questions were welcomed. The narrator understood now that responsibility does not mean having all the answers. It means responding with respect, patience, and care. Looking back, the narrator no longer felt embarrassed by the answer they gave that day. It was part of a process, a starting point. Not perfect, but human, and that was the most important lesson of all. Life does not ask for perfection, it asks for sincerity. As the story comes to its end, the narrator walks forward with that truth, ready to listen, ready to respond, ready to grow, one simple moment at a time.